In this lecture video, we're going to look at ways in which we can apply utilitarian ethics to business. Specifically, we're going to look at Robert Audi's article, Can Utilitarianism Be Distributive? Maximization and Distribution as Criteria in Managerial Decisions. So first, let's just recount what utilitarianism argues. So we can look at the principle of utility as formulated by John Stuart Mill, where he says, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So the goal in utilitarianism is to, in general, promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So this is a consequentialist ethics. It says that it focuses on the consequences of our actions and not whether something is good, in and of itself, for example, or whatever other reason, right? It's always what are you going to do? What have you done? Or what have you, maybe not even done, like physically? What have you thought? What are the effects of that? And do those effects, reduce pain or produce happiness? If so, good. Do they reduce happiness or promote pain? If so, bad. And there are two main ways of looking at this. So one is known as act utilitarianism, where we would focus on specifically each individual action, right? So did my action right now, if I held the door open for someone as they were walking behind me, did that specific act produce happiness or, pain, right? I would judge that act based on that. Or we could say, okay, let's look at, all the individual acts I've done in the past year. Overall, right, maybe I've done some things that produce pain, but overall, if we added up all the acts, was there more happiness that was produced than pain, right? So we can weigh things that way. Another way of looking at utilitarianism is through rule utilitarianism, where we look at what are certain rules that will that tend to, let's say, produce happiness, right? So we should follow then certain rules which end up promoting happiness or which reduce consequences that produce pain. So Audi argues that we can compare utilitarianism to a kind of cost-benefit analysis where, let's say we're weighing up our options. Do I go to grad school or do I not? I'm going to weigh, what are the benefits? What are the pros, so to speak, right? Then what are the cons? And then overall, which one outweighs the other? Audi says that utilitarianism operates in a similar way. The way in which it, of course, compares then the acts that produce pleasure and the acts that produce pain, and we see, overall which one weighs more to determine whether our actions are good or bad. Now, the pivotal problem, he says, for utilitarianism is to predict the effects of options on pleasure and pain. And it is a pivotal problem because it's difficult then, actually pin down in a quantitative manner the effects of our actions. So he says, in principle, there is no time limit on the chain of effects of our deeds. Utilitarians must either ignore the potentially infinite stream of consequences or estimate them from data at the time of decision. Facts about the present may or may not be a good guide to the indefinite future. So sometimes, right, we might make decisions based on evidence right now that says definitely what you are doing is producing an overall net happiness, we could, or an aggregate happiness. Now this could have been the case, let's say 100, 150, probably we'll say 120 years ago, right? The year 1900. We'll say that all evidence would have said, hey, the production of oil and gas cars and things like that, that overall is a good thing because it raises then happiness of people. It lowers the suffering that people experience. Now, though, new facts have come to light, and we know actually the effect of the automobile industry is to contribute to climate change, for example. So in the long run, right? There will be aggregate pain and suffering caused by the continuation of the pollution of fossil fuels from cars, right? Now, because of this, it means utilitarianism is always subject to revision in those kinds of ways. And this is, again, the pivotal problem here in weighing out the aggregates for utilitarianism. Additionally, then, as I've already mentioned, it's difficult to really quantify kinds of pleasures or pains, and where we really rely on people's experiences and then comparing people's experiences. Comparing this to, let's say, economics and business transactions, where we use monetary value, in contrast to that, hedonic value then is far more difficult to measure when we want to compare then monetary and hedonic value as we do in business ethics. There are a few ways, though, that we can look at ways that utilitarianism can aid distribution in business decisions. The first one is to look at the inclusiveness standard in distribution. So suppose I am a benefits manager and I'm wanting to extend medical help to as many of my company's employees as I can, right? I'm in charge of changing the healthcare policy, for example. Now, there are two priorities then I might take into account. Now, first, of course, I am going to take into account, right, the top priority is inclusiveness, right? If I'm wanting to promote the inclusiveness standard, then inclusiveness, making sure I don't exclude people from, the new health insurance policy, is my chief concern. But another concern I might have is preference for the ordering of policies according to the overall aggregate medical good that they promote. Now, what this might mean is I might then come up with two different options for new medical policies I can implement. Now, option A was where 1,000 employees could receive benefits whose aggregate total is, let's say, 10,000, right? So we'll say 10,000 pleasure. However we, want to measure hedonic value, we'll just say there is some way to do it, and it results in 10,000 pleasures. Option B is where 750 employees receive benefits whose aggregate total is 11,500 pleasures. So it happens that we can actually give, because maybe, this sounds terrible, but some people don't have cancer, and we say, well, we don't want to cover cancer, well, I guess it might be the reverse. We do want to cover cancer, let's say, but what that means is because of the amount of money we can afford to spend on health insurance for our employees, we can't include everyone, right? So we can't be as inclusive as we want, but the overall aggregate pleasure produced is greater than if we try to include more people. Now, what might then the inclusiveness standard argue? It would prefer option A, where 1,000 employees receive benefits whose aggregate total is 10,000. The reason is that, one, we already have then seen that the aggregate is pretty close to option B, but the difference is we have a good, 25% more number of employees that can be affected by this policy. And if we take each individual, the difference between one person being insured and another person not being insured at all, the difference between the pleasure and pain in that is far greater than, of course, option B, having less people insured, but some of those having a little bit more pleasure received. Now, for example, some of the kinds of consideration then this kind of a manager here in this decision might take into account are, one, preference for pain reduction, having all other things equal. So we might consider, okay, when I'm weighing the different kinds of policies here, can I find policies where, if pain and pleasure received are equal, maybe I prefer the option that limits pain over maximizing happiness if the amount they're able to do is equal. Another kind of consideration is prioritizing pain. Maybe I won't even consider creating happiness at all because I say, well, it's actually more important that if there's suffering right now, I reduce that suffering. I take away pain. That's one way I might approach then looking at aggregates in these kinds of decisions. A third way I might look at it is prioritizing the saving of lives. So I might then say, okay, I want to make sure that I can have certain treatments that ensure, maybe people had to suffer through illnesses, but if there's life-threatening illnesses, I prioritize those over other ones that maybe just kind of are annoying. Finally, another kind of consideration is quantifying with respect to stakeholder groups. So I might then want to take into account the kind of different stakeholder groups and say, well, maybe the shareholders I'm going to give more weight to than the employees, or I'm going to give more weight to employees than shareholders, or customers to suppliers, different things like that. And so when I'm considering policies, I might then weigh out, okay, in this situation, I want to have the most inclusive health insurance policy I can offer to my employees. However, this is going to mean customers might have to pay a little bit more for the products we make. But if I then weight the employees higher than the customers, then I might say, well, it's something I'm willing to do for the fact that then when I weigh out the overall aggregate, because I've already given, I have determined that there are more employees that will benefit, and their benefiting is greater than the way in which customers might have to pay a little bit more for the product. It outweighs then the kind of less happiness customers might experience. Right? So these are different kinds of considerations I might take into account when determining, a kind of a new health insurance policy for my employees using the Inclusiveness Standard of distribution. Now, another kind of distribution might be the qualified aggregation distribution. In this way, I seek the overall maximum aggregate, but one that is qualified. So there's a specific kind of goal of which then I'm looking at the different kinds of aggregations. So, for example, I may want to produce as much total medical benefit as possible with regard to medical coverage choices. Right, so that might be my exclusive goal. I'm not worried about anything else, just that. And I want to know, all right, when I look at my choices, which one produces the overall greatest aggregate medical coverage? So in this case, my priority is maximizing the aggregate good, because I'm literally seeking to take away as much pain as I can, and therefore create as much happiness as I can, maybe through ease of mind, right, having this insurance. And that means my second priority would be to institute a policy that helps as many employees as we can without a sacrifice in total medical benefit. So if there's a sacrifice in total medical benefit, that's the point at which I stop, trying to cover more employees. So we can see then how this way, inclusiveness isn't going to be the top priority. Now, if we take those first two options we looked at previously, where the inclusiveness aggregation prefers option 1, the qualified aggregation distribution prefers option B. Because if 750 employees receive benefits whose aggregate total is $11,500, then that means there's a greater overall medical benefit that is able to be secured as compared to option A. And that's what I'm privileging here in this kind of distribution. Now, there might be a few more ranges of options here. So we can look at C, D, and E. D is preferable to C because, of course, there's 100 more people that are going to be able to receive the same kind of aggregate distribution of medical benefits as compared to option C. But option E then is preferable to both D and C, because then there's an additional 100 more than option D, an additional 200 more than option C that are going to receive medical benefits, where the aggregate total is the exact same as compared to options D and C. Now, the final kind of distribution we'll look at is an egalitarian interpretation of distribution. So in this case, Suppose I'm a manager in a startup company, and I need, I've been looking at how my new employees have been faring throughout the year, and I need to rearrange salaries. So some things then I might take into account is the fact that perhaps all of my new employees, their work has been on par with one another. In this situation, then I might believe that if they end up discovering the percentage of raise others receive when they all did equal work, then it might actually be best for me to treat all of them equally with their pay. So in this case, my top priority is to produce for this considered population of the new employees the greatest determinate good. My two options might be A, where 20 of my employees then receive a 5% raise with an aggregate total then of $500,000 being given to them. Or option B, where my 20 employees receive varying raises, where some might receive a 2% raise, some a 3%, some a 5%, where I'm actually able overall to spend more money, $600,000, giving them raises. Now in this case, because my top priority is to produce the greatest determinate good, I would choose option A, because even though there would be an overall greater aggregate of money being spent in option B, with option A there's an overall greatest determinate good because of the equality in which people are receiving their raises. And then for everybody, right, that means happiness goes up. So the overall good is greater than option B. Now, what Audi does then is provide some empirical reasons as to why there are incentives for using the utilitarian approach for issues of distribution in the workplace, in business. The first empirical incentive for taking this utilitarian distributive approach is that people, he says, tend to resent unequal distributions of certain common kinds. So people typically, if they see, hey, look, this person over here ends up getting paid more than I am, what the hell, that's not fair, they might then get upset, and that's going to reduce overall happiness. Second reason of why you might have this incentive is that resentment is either painful or it tends to cause pain. And if the first reason is true, then according to the second reason, well, we don't want to promote pain. The third reason is that people actually then tend to accept equal distribution. They tend to accept the idea that one should do what is the greatest good for the greatest number. So already then we have an implicit endorsement of utilitarian distributive principles. The fourth reason, acceptance of equal distribution tends then to reduce pain. And the fifth reason, why distribution is desirable given a hedonic analog of the declining marginal utility of money. So we know that if we just, for example, in some of those kinds of aggregates we looked at, even if some people are actually receiving a little bit more money than others, we can look at the kind of happiness that's produced. There's quite a, someone might experience a little bit more happiness in getting, let's say, a 5% raise than not having a raise at all, right? Or I should say, someone would probably receive a little bit more happiness in receiving a 5% raise as compared to a 3% raise. But if giving that person a 3% raise so that we can also give another person a 3% raise as opposed to no raise at all, even though then that first person is getting a 3% raise instead of a 5% raise, because it allows the other person to also get a raise instead of no raise at all, overall happiness is increased. And according then to utilitarianism, we would be producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that is why then we should look at these empirical results that Audi is presenting for us as to why we should use distributive methods of, or utilitarian methods of distribution, I should say.